Nuclear arms matters have to be a priority for any president in the nuclear age because nuclear weapons represent one of the only existential threats to the human race. And so if you think about the bomb and its various dangers as being something that could still affect us in ways we can't even necessarily foresee, whether a terrorist strike, a loose nuclear weapon getting into the wrong hands, probably not a U.S.-Russia outright intentional nuclear war, but perhaps other kinds of conflict in other parts of the world growing into a nuclear conflict. Whatever you can do to reduce that danger is important, even if it's slow, indirect, and frustrating in many of the dynamics that are associated with that. The United States hasn't tested nuclear weapons now in 20 years. Other established nuclear powers haven't tested in at least 16, so this is a moratorium that's now been going on for quite a while. The last country that tested was North Korea in 2009. It's not an official nuclear power. India and Pakistan tested back in 1998. So we've had some tests since. China and France, I believe, were the last of the big five to test. So in a sense, we have a moratorium already, and that's useful. However, this is sort of an unstable equilibrium in the sense that there is no binding treaty regime because the United States and China would need to ratify before anyone else, including us, could be bound by this treaty. So we're seeing not any kind of treaty-related restraint, but an unofficial moratorium that's always fragile. And I think it's been very helpful to have this strong norm established against nuclear testing. So it sure would be nice to formalize it and make it more permanent. It would also be a way to reassure ourselves that China's not going to modernize its nuclear arsenal as it thinks about competing with the United States more in other domains of military capability. I think it's very possible, and the next 5 to 10 years are going to be fascinating in this regard and extremely important. It's one of the reasons why we really call the book The Opportunity. I'd say there are two big concepts behind that title, at least from my perspective. One is, in the U.S.-Russia process, bringing in tactical and surplus warheads into the accounting scheme in a way we never have before, so that the limit on a future treaty would apply to all these kinds of weapons as well as to the traditional long-range or strategic warheads. That's one way in which we see an opportunity. The other way is once you get that done, and maybe along with that same process, maybe in a simultaneous set of actions, you could start to see other nuclear powers make the first baby steps towards getting involved in the process as well. Up until now, they've had the understandable reply. Everybody else has far fewer weapons than Russia and the United States by a factor of 20 or 30 or 40, and so why should they be involved in any kind of an arms reduction process that they, somewhat correctly, blame us for creating in the first place? It's a problem that Moscow and Washington need to solve largely on their own. But as we start to get down to levels of 1,000 long-range warheads on a side, 2,500 total warheads, 2,000 to 2,500 for either Russia or the U.S., it starts to be a situation where other powers might reassess. I think you need to learn a lot about how the arms control mechanics work. You also need for the world to stabilize a bit more. The great powers especially. They're getting along pretty well, but the United States and China still have some issues between them, like the disputed status of Taiwan. And there are a couple too many big issues and problems in places like Korea and the Middle East, where I think we'd have to worry that our potential adversaries were cheating if there were any kind of treaty regimen. Now, you can make verification very good, but you may or may not be able to make it perfect. And so you've got to think through a lot of the mechanics of whether you can really go to this world while you've got 5 or 6 lingering big problem countries out there in tense parts of the world. And you've got to think through how you might rebuild an arsenal, at least for temporary purposes, if you ever need it, because somebody else violates the treaty. So there's a lot to think about, and I think a lot of things need to improve in terms of international politics and in terms of scientific methods of verification before we can really answer the question. I think, however, that making this a goal, and a real goal, is actually useful, because proliferation ultimately is a bigger danger than great power war in this 21st century, in my judgment. And we need to therefore create every tool possible against proliferation.